Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today it's a bit of a different review because I'm looking at both the Gieseler Audio Kraftwerk 2 single and dual linear power supplies. But as part of that, I'm also looking at linear power supplies in general. And specifically, I'll be talking about what the differences are between switch mode power supplies like this one and a linear power supply like the Gieselers, both in terms of their design, their size, their benefits, their drawbacks, but also the sound quality improvements you can potentially expect from something like these linear power supplies across a wide range of gear. So I've paired the Gieselers up with a whole bunch of different products that I'll get to later, where I'll describe exactly what I heard difference-wise between the stock switch mode power supply that came with each device, and then using it with the Geshelli Audio Kraftwerk 2 as a linear power supply instead of the switch modes. So sit back, relax, and let's explore linear power supplies. It's important to note as we begin this process that there's no definitive evidence that either a switch mode or a linear power supply is 100% all the time going to be better than one or the other. What I'm basically saying here is that it's going to come down to the power supply itself. So whilst the focus of this review is on the Geshelli Audio Kraftwerk, I do also want to flag the fact that there's nothing wrong with a good switch mode power supply. You shouldn't feel that you absolutely have to buy a linear power supply to get good sound, but I'll try to demonstrate through this review what the pros and cons of linear power supplies are versus the switch mode, and also what I think the linear power supplies from Geshelli Audio specifically can bring to your system. But before we get there, let's talk about the differences and what these different power supplies are. This one I've got in front of me here is a basic switch mode power supply. I think this came with an old Burson audio amplifier, but essentially they're all much the same. The differences are this one is a linear, so like an inline power supply. You'd have your normal figure 8 cable plugging in there, and then you've got the lead that goes to your product. But this is no different really to a wall wart where you'd have the prongs sticking out of this and it would plug into the wall. So whether it's inline or whether it's a wall wart, they're both switch mode power supplies and they're going to work exactly the same way. And that is that inside these devices, you've got a transistor or maybe a few transistors that are operating in a way where they're switching on and off rapidly to reduce the 240 or 110 volt incoming power down to an operating voltage that suits your device. It might be 5 volts, 9 volts, 12 volts, whatever it needs to be. In contrast, when we look at the linear power supplies, these use a coil, a wire-wound coil, to take that incoming voltage and to drop it down to whatever the output voltage needs to be. And so both are actually doing the same job, they're just doing it slightly differently. And that brings us to the pros and cons. As you can see, the switch mode power supply I'm holding here, despite being a large switch mode power supply, when you think about some of the tiny little wall warts around, this is still a lot smaller than the linear power supplies you see in front of me. And that's because the transistors are much smaller than a full wire-wound coil like you've got in the linears. That's not taking into account the fact that there is also an external transformer that operates with these, so they're even bigger and bulkier still. They're just separated into two boxes. Beyond the size factor though, there's a few other things to consider. Generally, switch mode power supplies like this will be much cheaper than a linear power supply, and then over and above that, you've got a few other sort of hidden factors that you may not otherwise be aware of. And this comes down to the cons or the drawbacks of each different device. With a switch mode power supply, one of the risks that you have is that rapid switching of that transistor is going to create high frequency noise that can affect the audio quality. On the flip side, if we look at the linear power supplies, that wire-wound coil that's doing the reduction of the voltage, that produces electromagnetic radiation. What that means is that there's the potential, if you have these in close proximity to your audio devices, there is the potential for that radiation to interfere with the performance and the sound quality of your audio devices. On top of that, linear power supplies are much less efficient and they're going to produce heat. It doesn't mean they're dangerous, it doesn't mean they're going to burn you, but they're certainly not going to run as cool as a switch mode power supply. So the key point I want you to take away from this is that both technologies have their benefits and their drawbacks. Something else that's important to be aware of is that the quality of a switch mode power supply or a linear power supply can vary. In other words, if you go out and you buy yourself a high quality audio specific switch mode power supply, it's probably going to be better than some cheap crappy linear power supply. So keep in mind when I'm testing this and talking about the benefits I've heard using the Gieselers, these are very high quality linear power supplies. And so you should expect improvements because there's a lot more engineering and design gone into these than your generic off-the-shelf switch mode power supply. And so with all that said, I'm going to wrap up and say that there are arguments for both switch mode and linear. I'm not here to say that one is definitively better or worse than the other. My aim is to share my experience specifically with the Gieseler audios and to use that as a demonstration of what you might expect if you were to pick up a similar quality power supply to these. Now, Gieseler Audio are an Australian company. I believe these are only available in Australia, and so do keep that in mind. These may not be available to you wherever you're watching from. But that's not a reason to stop watching the video, because there's lots of companies making excellent linear power supplies. And so what you're going to hear me talk about from the Gieselers could easily translate to whatever you can pick up locally if you're spending roughly the same ballpark money and making sure you're getting a quality power supply. And so with all that said, let me now introduce the Geshelli Audio Kraftwerk 2 and Kraftwerk 2 Dual. To immediately put these into context, the single and the dual are identical circuits, with the difference being that the dual allows you to have two different outputs from the same chassis, and also to have some variable voltage, as I'll explain in a moment. Beyond that though, they're both the same basic design in terms of the circuitry used, the design of the circuit, all that sort of stuff. The single Kraftwerk 2 here that I have to drive my Chord Hugo M scaler, this is a fixed output version that retails for $600 US. And what it means when I say it's got a fixed output is that there's no ability to change the voltage coming out of this. I bought this specifically to drive the M scaler, and therefore I knew that I needed 15 volts out. And so as you'll see on the back here, it's got a single 15 volt DC output. No ability to change what it outputs, it just takes the 15 volt input in the AC and spits out 15 volts DC. So that's a very simple design, it's a very simple product. In the sense, not that it's simple and easy for anyone to make it, there's clearly been a lot of design and care put into this, but it's simple in the fact that there's not many features or functions. You switch it on and it powers up, you switch it off, it powers down, that's it. Now you might be wondering, having seen that it's got a 15 volt input, you might be wondering what's going on there. I just talked about it stepping down using a power transformer, blah blah blah. What's going on with these, and I haven't got them on my desk because of space and cables and whatnot, is that each of these power supplies is fed by an external transformer. And so what's going on in here is the conversion from AC to DC, as well as adjustment of the voltage if needed, but it's being fed by an external transformer that's doing the step down from, in my case, 240 volts down to 15 volts. That's handled with an external transformer that I've got on the floor way away from my other components. And that's one of the ways that we can help to keep that electromagnetic interference further away from components. And so that gives you a sense of what's going on in a fixed output Geshelli Audio Kraftwerk 2. This is the single version, as I mentioned before. You can get this as a variable output version for an extra $50, or you can go to the dual version, which I've got here, and that now gives you two outputs. Now, as far as I can tell, when you go for the dual, you're always going to get this voltage control that you see here, and I'll show you that more in just a second. So I believe the dual always has that. To get the dual power supply, as I've got it here, is $900. So it's a much better choice if you're running two components that you need linear power supplies for. A, it means only one transformer and one box, versus if you had two of these, you'd have two transformers, two boxes, etc. So it makes a lot of sense to use the dual if you can, but do recognize that because you're handling more voltage and more current coming through these, there is the chance that you're going to have limitations based on what you put out, because there's a level of heat dissipation required. So not all configurations are possible. You'll need to chat with Clay over at Gieseler Audio, check out the website to find out what's going to work for you. My particular dual here though is set up with a 5 volt to 12 volt range. And it works in a very similar way to the single, in the sense that you've got here a very simple input for the DC, 2 different DC outs, and then in the middle there you've got the selector switches. And what's key to know is that with the selector switches, you've got the high and low options. And so you're going to set it up with high if you want it to be running the 9 volt to 12 volt range, and you're going to set it on low if you want the lower range of that scale. There's then the selector switches in blue there, which you just use a small screwdriver to select which voltage you want to output. And this is great because it means the dual here can be used with things like DACs from, say, topping, like an E50 or a D50, or you can turn it around and drive a 12 volt product, say something like a Geshelli E2 or a J2 or an xDuoo NT604, lots of different products, and I've compared this versus the stock power supplies with a whole bunch of them, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the final thing I want to talk about before I get there is just to explain that these are a beautifully made power supply. The external power supplies are bought separately, they're not made by Clay at Gieseler Audio, but I know he's carefully selected them to provide high quality performance. What Clay's then produced are these beautiful power supplies in lovely, solid, machined housings. Everything's really nicely printed and marked, both on the front and the back, but things are also kept, as I said before, very simple. Other than setting the voltage you need, making sure you've got it in the right high or low range, other than that, all you're doing is switching it on and switching it off. It's a very, very simple design and it keeps things working beautifully. And so with that said, what's most important here is how this sounds. So let's now talk about how the linear power supply affects the sound of a whole lot of different devices. I've tested these and written them up in no particular order, so as you see as we go through, my experiences are going to be a little bit different from one to the next, but there is a very common theme as you'll hear. Now just to clarify, with each of these tests, my only comparison is between the product with its stock provided switch mode power supply, and then comparing that to the sound using the Gieseler Audio Kraftwerk 2 dual as the case may be. It doesn't really matter that it's the dual or the single, but I want to be clear. The reason I use the dual is it's the one that allows me to change the voltage, and it was the one that had the appropriate voltage for the various devices I was trying. Having said that, if you were to buy the single, you're going to get exactly the same performance because, as I said before, it's exactly the same circuit design, it just doesn't have the variable voltage option. You can of course get it with the variable voltage option though, and so my point here is that regardless of which model you buy, whether it's the single fixed, the single variable, or the dual, you're going to get the same performance as I'm about to talk about. The first product I tried this with was the Geshelli J2 DAC. This uses a 12 volt switch mode power supply, and I know that Gino over at Geshelli Labs has carefully chosen what he believes is the best possible power supply for this product. So I was really keen to see if there was any difference, much difference, a benefit, a drawback in switching out the 12 volt switch mode and putting in the Gieseler Audio Kraftwerk 2 as a linear power supply alternative. The track I listened to for this particular test was Katie by Missy Higgins, and I immediately did notice some differences. The differences weren't huge, but they were definitely there. What I noticed was the sound was a little bit smoother and had a greater sense of openness overall. What I mean by that is that the guitars in this track were a little bit more separated. You could pick them out more cleanly within the mix, and the vocals were also clearer and more focused as well. Generally, the sense of space in the soundstage and instrument separation were both better compared to the switch mode power supply when I used the linear. So there was a definite upgrade in using the linear power supply on the J2, but I'd describe the overall change, and I'm going to do this for every single product here, is give you an end rating for what I heard. I describe this particular change as slight but obvious. In other words, it's enough that you can clearly hear it, but it's not like it completely transformed the product. It just improved it a little bit in terms of that spaciousness, that openness, and instrument separation, as I said before. And so while I was playing with Geshelli Labs products, I figured I might as well also try the Geshelli E2. This is an amazing amplifier that I raved about in my review of it, and I continue to highly recommend it. And I was really excited to see if it could actually get even better still. Once again, it comes with a 12 volt switch mode power supply, which has been carefully selected. And so I was kind of expecting the same sorts of benefits that I heard from the J2. But in the case of the E2, I think the benefits were even more pronounced. For this test, I was listening to Don't You Be Worried by Lionel Richie and the Commodores, and I immediately heard an improved sense of refinement and clarity in the sound. It felt to me like the sound was smoother overall, but also better tonally balanced using the linear power supply. When I went back to the switch mode, it was like everything got a bit flatter and the vocals were pushed a bit more forward, and not necessarily in a good way. I felt like the tonal balance, the overall presentation was more natural, a little bit more spacious, and generally smoother and more refined when I had the linear power supply in there. Now, if you're wondering why and how that might be, at the end of this I will summarise some thoughts and some theories as to how and why this might be, but for now let me give you my overall rating of the change on the E2, and that is to say that on this one I felt like the change was significant and obvious. I've traditionally thought that DACs might be more affected by power supply input than amplifiers, but on this particular occasion it's the Geshelli amp that had the more impact coming from the linear power supply rather than the DAC, and so I moved on to test some other gear. The next product I tested, which I actually forgot to put in my B-roll, so this might come as a bit of a surprise, is the Topping E50. This is another product that I raved about in my review. I think the E50 is an incredible DAC, and when you have the ability to drive it with better than USB power, because it's designed initially to just be powered from the USB socket, when you upgrade that power, it can get even better again. It seemed like too easy a test though to compare the USB power supply E50 to a full-on linear power supply, so instead I started this comparison using a 5-volt battery source. And it's a 5-volt battery source that I know from past testing is actually better than some of the generic phone chargers and the like that I've got sitting around. For this test I was listening to The Fuse by Jackson Browne, and once again the experience going from the 5-volt battery source over to the linear power supply was a smoother, more refined and overall better sound. What was particularly interesting was that when I moved to the linear power supply for the Topping E50, I felt like the bass became fuller. Now I don't think the bass actually changed though. I think what was different was that there's a level of treble haze, treble glare, whatever you want to call it, when using the battery or even worse the USB power supply. And when you remove that bit of treble haze, it actually adjusts the way we perceive the sound and allows us to hear more of the bass. So I don't think the bass actually improved so much as the treble came down and everything became more balanced and on the same level. To double check this, I switched back to the battery, and what I found was that the sound became flatter, more two-dimensional, and there was more sense of emphasis on things like cymbals. And so that's why I came to that conclusion that I don't think the bass actually increased so much as the treble pulled back into a more natural and balanced state. And so I'm going to rate this one overall as also significant and obvious, just like the E2. Sticking with DACs, the next product I tried was the EarMen Tradutto. Now hopefully I'm saying that right. I've got the review of this one coming soon, so if I am saying it wrong, please let me know down in the comments how I should be pronouncing that one. And of course I should mention that if you want to see my review of the Tradutto, do make sure you've hit subscribe and rung the bell because that one's coming soon, and I'll say right now, it's a beautiful little DAC. But without giving anything more away, let's talk about the shift between the switch mode power supply that comes with the Tradutto and the linear power supply. This is a 12-volt device, so I was running the dual on its maximum 12-volt setting for this one, and the track that I was listening to was The Stranger by Billy Joel. My first thought when I went from the switch mode power supply to the linear was that it sounded to me like the sound lost a little bit of its dynamics. It was like there was less energy coming through. Having said that, I felt like the clarity was a bit better, so things like guitars and percussion were a bit better resolved, there was a better sense of clarity around them, and so it was a little bit of a quandary, a little bit of contrast there, that I was losing energy but gaining clarity. And when I switched back to the switch mode power supply, there was definitely more energy. And the sound was a little bit more dynamic, potentially you could say, but it was not in a good way. It was becoming more forceful, it was pushed at you a little bit, it came across a little bit too aggressive in comparison. Now I'm not saying overall that the Tradutto is an overly aggressive DAC, because it's not. My point is that going from the linear power supply back to the switch mode power supply brought an extra level of energy and attack, and it wasn't necessarily a good energy and attack when compared between the two. Overall, what I feel like was that having the linear power supply in the mix revealed the character and the quality of the recording a bit better. It took something away that shouldn't necessarily have been in the end reproduction, and that to me was beneficial. Having said that, when I got to what you might call the chorus in this track, I'm not sure if it actually is the chorus, but when you get to the more congested sections in The Stranger, it did sound to me like there was less clarity and separation of the sounds when I was using the linear power supply. And so it's a really interesting situation I'm in here, where what I'm hearing is on one hand sound that I prefer a little bit with the linear power supply, but then there's other factors that I don't necessarily prefer with the linear power supply. And that's where I said at the very beginning of all this, there is no definitive sense that linear is always better or switch mode is always better. It could come down to the individual product. Now for me, I think what's actually going on here is that when you add high frequency noise to a signal, it can actually cause us to perceive a greater sense of clarity. And so what I think is going on here is that when we've got the switch mode power supply connected up to the Tradutto, what I think is actually happening is that it's bringing an extra level of high frequency noise or haze into the mix, which is artificially enhancing our sense of clarity. In some cases, like this particular track, The Stranger, that's actually beneficial because it's helping to separate the more congested passages. The rest of the time though, the sound from the linear power supply is actually beneficial because it's smoother, it's taking away any artificial sense of clarity and allowing me to hear more of the actual mix. And so this is an interesting one. The Tradutto is a slightly smooth DAC to start with, and that's where maybe the linear power supply is taking it too far in that direction. Whereas the switch mode power supply maybe is the perfect match because it actually keeps a bit of that energy, that aggression and that attack. I'll look to explore this a little bit more in my specific review of the Tradutto, so do stay tuned, make sure you subscribe and watch out for that one. For now, what I'm going to say is that the change from the switch mode power supply to the linear power supply is significant, but I'm not going to go as far as saying which one is better or worse. I'm just going to say it definitely made a difference. And so let's now jump to my final product test, which was the xDuoo MT604. This is a tube amp that I also love, so most of the products in this review are products that I thoroughly enjoy, and the xDuoo 604 is easily one of the best examples of that. This is a brilliant amp in its stock form. You can then roll tubes and make it even better, and now the question was, if you change the power supply, can you make it even better still? The MT604, just like the Tradutto before it, takes a 12-volt input, and I was testing this combination using the track Love Is Hard by James Morrison. Initially, I was expecting this test to be the most difficult because there's some time required between when you switch off the amp, unplug the power, plug in the different power supply and switch it back on, you've got to wait for the tubes to warm up. And so there was an element of concern for me around the auditory memory required and whether or not I was going to be able to give an accurate sense of what I was hearing. But what I noticed straight away was that the difference is so significant here that there was no question at all. The most obvious and immediate difference that I heard was much better separation of sounds. Because of that better separation, the image becomes much more focused, so things like James Morrison's vocals get really clearly focused for you. The guitar has a better sense of separation and clarity from the rest of the mix. And there's a piano playing on the right-hand side of the soundstage, which has a much more holographic nature to it when I'm using the linear power supply compared to the switch mode. The sound's still great with the switch mode power supply, but it was incredible the difference that the linear made here. And I'm putting that down to the fact that we're talking about a pretty cheap product here. This is a sub $200 balanced tube amplifier. And so to get that sort of product at that sort of price, I'm guessing the switch mode power supply is a pretty basic unit. Now it's a little bit insane to be pairing a $200 device with a $900 linear power supply, or $600 if you go with the fixed output single version. But even so, spending 3 times as much on the power supply makes no sense at all. So I'm not suggesting you should rush out and buy a $200 tube amp and a $600 power supply for it. But what it tells me is if you're in the position where you can feed an xDuoo MT602, 604, potentially the 601, with a better quality power supply, you're in for a real treat. Overall, what you'll hear is sound that gets clearer, more refined, a better sense of clarity, a better sense of separation, just everything about it got so much better. I didn't have time to go through and see just how good it got and what I could compare it to at higher price points. But at some point I might re-explore that one and find out just how good the 604 can be when paired up with a quality power supply, and see if it can start to match amplifiers in that $400, $500, $600 range or above. So let me know in the comments, is that something you want me to deep dive down that rabbit hole, or do you not really care? Let me know down below. For now though, I'm going to wrap up this one by saying, as you probably already gathered, that the use of the linear power supply on the MT604 was a major change. It was easily the most dramatic. So as you can see, going from switch mode to a linear power supply seems to consistently provide changes. In most cases, those changes are clearly beneficial, and again we're talking about basic switch mode power supplies going to a high quality linear power supply. But in all those cases, or almost all those cases, the changes were beneficial. In the case of the Tradutto, I could see it going either way, but I think I'd still probably lean towards the linear power supply as being slightly better overall. And so let me wrap up with a bit of an explanation of what I think is going on here. I think ultimately what's happening is that the switch mode power supplies are introducing some high frequency noise into the circuit. That could be doing a couple of things. One of them is that it could be actually coming through all the way through the circuit into your headphones and influencing how you perceive sound. I'll come back to that in a second because you might be thinking, if it's super high frequency, how could it influence it? But bear with me. Or the other thing that's happening is that it's just disrupting the way the circuit is operating in the amplifier or the DAC and colouring the sound in that way. In other words, maybe that high frequency noise from the power supply never actually makes it to your ears, but is just doing enough to upset and offset some of the production of the sound within the amplifier or DAC. I'm not sure which one it is. I can only tell you exactly what I'm hearing, and that is a consistent benefit in terms of smoother, more refined sound, a more open and separated soundstage, a general sense of refinement and clarity with the linear power supplies, and a generally improved tonal balance because the reduction of treble haze allowed everything else to come more into balance. And so overall, everything was just generally better. Now, I said I'd come back around to what might be happening if high frequency noise is making it all the way through from the power supply and getting to your ears. If that's happening, it's high frequency noise that you can't actually consciously perceive. But there's some really interesting new studies that are starting to show that somehow our brains do actually process and respond to high frequency inaudible content. The studies that I've linked down below talk about things like the fact that the brain is active when there's high frequency content and becomes inactive when that content's taken away. It also looks at the fact that there are signs that having high frequency content as part of the music, the stuff that belongs in the music in terms of resonance and harmonics, keeping those, even though they're inaudible in the track, can actually improve our sense of perceptual enjoyment of the music and increase our comfortable listening levels. So in other words, there are things going on that are directly influencing our ability to enjoy the music at a higher volume level potentially, and that has implications in terms of the perceptions of dynamics, the fullness of the sound, all those sorts of things. There is lots going on that speaks to the fact that high frequency content that's meant to be in the music is actually beneficial to our experience. I'm then taking that a step further and saying, what if we're adding high frequency content that's not meant to be in the music? If our brain's clever enough to recognize that there's high frequency content there, then what happens when it recognizes that there's high frequency content that's not meant to be there? Does that go in the opposite direction and degrade our listening experience slightly? These are all questions that haven't yet been answered, but I'm excited to see people exploring it, and I look forward to seeing more and more studies on this to find out more about what's going on with things like this linear power supply versus switch mode power supply comparison. So for now, I'm going to wrap everything up by saying, if you're in a situation where you can get a linear power supply for your devices, and you can get a quality one, then there's a really good chance you're going to get benefits. If you're here in Australia, then I highly recommend reaching out to Clay at Gieseler Audio or just jumping over to his website and buying directly. These are a beautifully made power supply. They've improved the sound of things like my Chord Hugo M scaler. I run my JCAT network and USB cards from them. And I'm currently talking to Clay about picking up another one for testing devices such as the Tradutto, such as the Geshelli Labs E2, J2, etc. So if you're in the market for linear power supply and you're here in Australia, do make sure you check out Gieseler Audio. I'll put a link down below. If you're elsewhere in the world, do make sure if you're buying a linear power supply, you're buying a quality one. There are cheap basic options on places like eBay, AliExpress, but I can't guarantee you're going to get the same experience with those that I've had with something like the Gieselers. So I do think it's worth investing a little bit, but obviously balance that up with what it is you're going to be driving with it. So I hope you found this review useful. If you have, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe, ring the bell, hit the like button, let YouTube know that you want to see more videos like this, and specifically more videos from me if you've enjoyed my content. And for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.